In this lecture, we will learn about Python's datetime class. This section is going to introduce the concept of working with dates and times in software engineering. A datetime in computer programming is just an object that has information about a date and a time. When building apps, anytime you want to work with date and time data, you're going to want to use datetimes in your code. Up at the top of the code, we're going to import the datetime module. The datetime module contains a constant named min-year. Min-year represents the smallest possible amount of years for a date time, which is 1. To demonstrate how this constant works, we will use Python's print function and pass in datetime.minyear. When we run the code, you will notice that 1 was output to the console. There is also a max-year constant within the datetime namespace. Max-year is the maximum possible number of years a datetime can contain. We will print out datetime.maxyear. When we run the code, you will notice that 9999 was printed to the console. The datetime module contains the datetime class, which contains some very useful functions for working with datetimes, and basically models an object that contains date and time data. Let's take a look at how to work with the datetime class in Python. The datetime class has a today function, which will give us the current local date and time without time zone information. We will print out the result of datetime.datetime.today. When we run the code, you will notice that we get some numbers as output. Let's look at what each of these means. First is the year, then the month, and then the day. Then comes the time in hours, minutes, and seconds. Notice that a dash separates the values in the date data, and a colon separates the values in the time data. The datetime class also has a now function, which gives us the current local date time with time zone information. We will use Python's print function and pass in datetime.datetime.now. When we run the code, you will notice that the date and time information was printed to the console. The UTC-now function will give us UTC time. UTC stands for Universal Time Coordinated. To get the current UTC time, we can use the UTC-now function. We will print out the result of datetime.datetime.utcnow using Python's print function. When we run the code, you will notice that the current UTC time was printed to the console. Now let's take a deeper look at actually creating a datetime. The datetime class has a constructor function that we can use to create our own datetime. For example, let's create a variable named dt and set it equal to datetime.datetime. We will pass in the year, then the month, and then the day. For example, we can pass in 2007 for the year, 5 for the month, and 3 for the day. A datetime has a year attribute that we can use to reference the year of our datetime. For example, we could print out dt.year to the console. When we run the code, you will notice that 2007 was printed to the console. Similarly, we can use a datetime's month attribute to reference the month for our datetime. We will use the print function and print out dt.month to the console. When we run the code, you will notice that 5 was printed, which is the month we specified when we created our datetime. The day attribute gives us the day that our datetime contains. For example, we can print out dt.day. When we run the code, you will notice that 3 was printed, which is the day for our datetime. We can also print out the hour for our datetime. When we created our datetime, we didn't specify an hour, so this value will be 0 currently. The same thing goes for the minute and second attributes. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python's date class.